The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 5, Side 1. Justinian's death was one more point at which antiquity might be said to end. He was a true Roman emperor, thinking in terms of all the empire, east and west, struggling to keep back the barbarians and to bring again to the vast realm an orderly government of homogeneous laws. He had accomplished a good measure of this aim. Africa, Dalmatia, Italy, Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and part of Spain had been regained. The Persians had been driven out of Syria. The empire had doubled its extent in his reign. Though his legislation was barbarously severe on heresy and sexual immorality, it represented, by its unity, lucidity, and scope, one of the peaks in the history of law. His administration was sullied with official corruption, extreme taxation, capricious pardons and punishments, but it was also distinguished by a painstaking organization of imperial economy and government, and it created a system of order which, though a stranger to freedom, held civilization together in a corner of Europe while the rest of the continent plunged into the Dark Ages. He left his name upon the history of industry and art. St. Sophia is also his monument. To orthodox contemporaries it must have seemed that once more the empire had turned back the tide and won a respite from death. It was a pitifully brief respite. Justinian had left the treasury empty as he had found it full. His intolerant laws and thieving tax-gatherers had alienated nations as fast as his armies had conquered them. And those armies, decimated, scattered, and ill-paid, could not long defend what they had so devastatingly won. Africa was soon abandoned to the Berbers, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Africa, and Spain to the Arabs, Italy to the Lombards. Within a century after Justinian's death, the empire had lost more territory than he had gained. With proud hindsight, we may see how much better it would have been to gather the rising nations and creeds into a federated union, to offer friendship to the Ostrogoths who had governed Italy comparatively well, and to serve as a protective medium through which the ancient culture might flow unstinted to the newborn states. We need not accept Procopius's estimate of Justinian. It was refuted by Procopius himself. He was a great ruler whose very faults sprang from the logic and sincerity of his creed. His persecutions from his certainty, his wars from his Roman spirit, his confiscations from his wars. We mourn the narrow violence of his methods and applaud the grandeur of his aims. He and Belisarius, not Boniface and Dacius, were the last of the Romans. Chapter 6. Byzantine Civilization, 326 to 565. 1. Work and wealth. Byzantine economy was a modernistic mixture of private enterprise, state regulation, and nationalized industries. Peasant proprietorship was still, under Justinian, the agricultural rule, but estates were expanding, and many farmers were being forced into feudal subjection to great landowners by drought or flood, competition or incompetence, taxation or war. The mineral resources of the soil were owned by the state, but were mostly mined by private agencies on governmental lease. The mines of Greece were exhausted, but old and new veins were worked in Thrace, Pontus, and the Balkans. Most industrial labor was free, that is, compelled only by a distaste for starvation. Direct slavery played a negligible role outside of domestic services and the textile industry, but in Syria, and probably in Egypt and North Africa, forced labor was used by the state to maintain the major irrigation canals. The government produced in its own factories most of the goods required by the army, the bureaucracy, and the court. About the year 552, some Nestorian monks from Central Asia interested Justinian with an offer to provide the empire with an independent source of silk. If we recall how many wars Greece and Rome had fought with Persia for the control of the trade routes to China and India, and remark the name Silk Route given to the northern passes to the Far East, the name Serica, or Silk Land, given by the Romans to China, and the name Serindia applied to the region between China and India, we shall understand why Justinian eagerly accepted the proposal. The monks went back to Central Asia and returned with the eggs of silkworms, and probably some seedlings of the mulberry tree. A small silk industry already existed in Greece, but it depended upon wild silkworms, feeding on oak, ash, or cypress leaves. Now silk became a major industry, especially in Syria and Greece. It developed to such an extent in the Peloponnesus as to give that peninsula the new name of Morea, land of the mulberry tree, or Morus alba. In Constantinople, the manufacture of certain silk fabrics and purple dyes was a state monopoly and was carried on in workshops in or near the imperial palace. Expensive silks and dyed fabrics were permitted only to high officials of the government, and the most costly could be worn only by members of the imperial family. When clandestine private enterprise produced and sold similar stuffs to unprivileged persons, Justinian broke this black market by removing most of the restrictions on the use of luxurious silks and dyes. He flooded the shops with state textiles at prices that private competition could not meet, and when the competition had disappeared, the government raised the prices. Following Diocletian's example, Justinian sought to extend governmental control to all prices and wages. After the plague of 542, the labor supply fell, wages rose, and prices soared. Like the English Parliament of 1351 after the plague of 1348, Justinian sought to help employers and consumers by a price and wage decree. We have learned that since the visitation of God, traders, artisans, husbandmen, and sailors have yielded to a spirit of covetousness and are demanding prices and wages 2 or 3 times as great as they formerly received. We forbid all such to demand higher wages or prices than before. We also forbid contractors for buildings or for agricultural or other work to pay the workmen more than was customary in old days. We have no information as to the effect of this decree. From Constantine to the latter part of Justinian's reign, domestic and foreign trade flourished in the Byzantine Empire. Roman roads and bridges were there kept in repair, and the creative lust for gain built maritime fleets that bound the capital with 100 ports in east and west. From the 5th century to the 15th, Constantinople remained the greatest market and shipping center in the world. Alexandria, which had held this supremacy from the 3rd century B.C., now ranked in trade below Antioch. All Syria throve with commerce and industry. It lay between Persia and Constantinople, between Constantinople and Egypt. Its merchants were shrewd and venturesome, and only the effervescent Greeks could rival them in the extent of their traffic and the subtlety of their ways. Their spread throughout the empire was a factor in that orientalization of manners and arts which marked Byzantine civilization. As the old trade route from Syria to Central Asia lay through hostile Persia, Justinian sought a new route by establishing friendly relations with the Himyarites of southwestern Arabia and the kings of Ethiopia, who between them controlled the southern gates of the Red Sea. Through those straits and the Indian Ocean, Byzantine merchantmen sailed to India. But Persian control of Indian ports wrung the same tolls from this trade as if it had passed through Iran. Defeated on this line, Justinian encouraged the development of harbors on the Black Sea. Along these stopping points, goods were shipped by water to Colchis, and thence by caravan to Sogdiana, where Chinese and Western merchants could meet and haggle without Persian scrutiny. The rising traffic on this northern route helped to raise Serindia to its medieval peak of wealth and art. Meanwhile, Greek commerce maintained its ancient outlets in the west. This active economy was supported by an imperial currency whose integrity gave it an almost global acceptance. Constantine had minted a new coin to replace Caesar's aureus. This solidus, or bezant, contained 4.55 grams, or 1/6 of a troy ounce of gold, and would be worth $5.83 in the United States of 1946. The metallic and economic deterioration of the solidus into the lowly sou illustrates the general rise of prices and depreciation of currencies through history, and suggests that thrift is a virtue which, like most others, must be practiced with discrimination. Banking was now highly developed. We may judge the prosperity of the Byzantine Empire at Justinian's accession by his fixing of the maximum interest rate at 4% on loans to peasants, 6% on private loans secured by collateral, 8% on commercial loans, and 12% on maritime investments. Nowhere else in the world of that time were interest rates so low. The senatorial aristocracy through land ownership, and the mercantile magnates through far-flung ventures in which the profits were commensurate with the risks, enjoyed such wealth and luxury as only a few had ever known in Rome. The aristocracy of the East had better tastes than that of Rome in the days of Cicero or Juvenal. It did not gorge itself on exotic foods, had a lower rate of divorce, and showed considerable fidelity and industry in serving the state. Its extravagance lay chiefly in ornate dress, in robes of furry hems and dazzling tints, in silken tunics preciously dyed, threaded with gold, and illuminated with scenes from nature or history. Some men were walking murals. On the garments of one senator could be found the whole story of Christ. Underneath this social crust of gold was a middle class fretted with taxation, a plodding bureaucracy, a medley of meddlesome monks, a flotsam and jetsam of proletaires exploited by the price system and soothed by the dole. Morals, sexual and commercial, were not appreciably different from those of other cultures at a like stage of economic development. Chrysostom condemned dancing as exciting passion, but Constantinople danced. The Church continued to refuse baptism to actors, but the Byzantine stage continued to display its suggestive pantomimes. People must be consoled for monogamy and prose. Procopius's secret history, never trustworthy, reports that practically all women were corrupt in his time. Contraceptives were a subject of assiduous study and research. Oribatius, the outstanding physician of the 4th century, gave them a chapter in his Compendium of Medicine. Another medical writer, Aetius, in the 6th century, recommended the use of vinegar or brine, or the practice of continence at the beginning and end of the menstrual period. Justinian and Theodora sought to diminish prostitution by banishing procuresses and brothel keepers from Constantinople, with transient results. In general, the status of woman was high. Never had women been more unfettered in law and custom, or more influential in government. 2. Science and Philosophy, 364 to 565. What, in this apparently religious society, was the fate of education, learning, literature, science, and philosophy? Primary instruction continued in the hands of private teachers paid by the parents per pupil and term. Higher education, till Theodosius II, was provided both by lecturers operating under their own power and through professors paid by city or state. Libanius complained that these were too poorly paid, that they longed through hunger to go to the baker, but refrained through fear of being asked to pay their debts. However, we read of teachers like Eumenius, who received 600,000 sesterces, possibly $30,000 a year. In this, as in other fields, the best and the worst received too much, the rest too little. Julian, to propagate paganism, introduced state examinations and appointments for all university teachers. Theodosius II, for opposite reasons, made it a penal offense to give public instruction without a state license, and such licenses were soon confined to conformists with the Orthodox creed. The great universities of the East were at Alexandria, Athens, Constantinople, and Antioch, specializing respectively in medicine, philosophy, literature, and rhetoric. Oribatius of Pergamum, who lived circa 325 to 403, physician to Julian, compiled a medical encyclopedia of 70 books. Aetius of Amida, court physician under Justinian, wrote a similar survey, distinguished by the best ancient analysis of ailments of the eye, ear, nose, mouth, and teeth, with interesting chapters on goiter and hydrophobia, and surgical procedures ranging from tonsillectomy to hemorrhoids. Alexander of Tralles, circa 525 to 605, was the most original of these medical authors. He named various intestinal parasites, accurately described disorders of the digestive tract, and discussed with unprecedented thoroughness the diagnosis and treatment of pulmonary diseases. His textbook of internal pathology and therapy was translated into Syriac, Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, and exercised in Christendom an influence only next to that of Hippocrates, Galen, and Soranus. According to Augustine, the vivisection of human beings was practiced in the 5th century. Superstition encroached daily on medicine. Most physicians accepted astrology, and some advised different treatments according to the position of the planets. Aetius recommended, for contraception, that the woman should suspend near her anus the tooth of a child, and Marcellus, in his De Medicamentis of 395, anticipated modern technique by urging the wearing of a rabbit's foot. Mules fared better than men. The most scientific work of the period was the Digestorum Artis Mulo Medicinae Libri Quadro of Flavius Vegetius, 383 to 450. This book almost founded veterinary science and remained an authority till the Renaissance. Chemistry and alchemy went hand in hand, with Alexandria as their center. The alchemists were generally sincere investigators. They employed experimental methods more faithfully than any other scientists of antiquity. They substantially advanced the chemistry of metals and alloys, and we cannot be sure that the future will not justify their aims. Astrology, too, had an honest base. Nearly everybody took it for granted that the stars, as well as the sun and moon, affected terrestrial events. But upon these foundations, quackery raised a weird ziggurat of magic, divination, and planetary abracadabra. Horoscopes were even more fashionable in medieval cities than in New York or Paris today. St. Augustine tells of two friends who noted carefully the position of the constellations at the birth of their domestic animals. Much of the nonsense of Arabic astrology and alchemy was part of Islam's Greek heritage. The most interesting figure in the science of this age is that of the pagan mathematician and philosopher Hypatia. Her father, Theon, is the last man whose name is recorded as a professor at the Alexandrian Museum. He wrote a commentary on Ptolemy's Syntaxis and acknowledged the share of his daughter in its composition. Hypatia, says Suidas, wrote commentaries on Diophantus, on the astronomical canon of Ptolemy, and on the conics of Apollonius of Perga. None of her works survives. From mathematics, she passed to philosophy, built her system on the lines of Plato and Plotinus, and according to the Christian historian Socrates, far surpassed all the philosophers of her time. Appointed to the chair of philosophy in the museum, she drew to her lectures a large audience of varied and distant provenance. Some students fell in love with her, but she seems never to have married. Suidas would have us believe that she married but remained a virgin nevertheless. Suidas transmits another tale, perhaps invented by her enemies, that when one youth importuned her, she impatiently raised her dress and said to him, "This symbol of unclean generation is what you are in love with, and not anything beautiful." She was so fond of philosophy that she would stop in the streets and explain, to anyone who asked, difficult points on Plato or Aristotle. Such was her self-possession and ease of manner, says Socrates, arising from the refinement and cultivation of her mind, that she not infrequently appeared before the city magistrates without ever losing in an assembly of men that dignified modesty of deportment for which she was conspicuous, and which gained for her universal respect and admiration. But the admiration was not quite universal, for she was not only a seductive unbeliever, but an intimate friend of Orestes, the pagan prefect of the city. When Archbishop Cyril instigated his monastic followers to expel the Jews from Alexandria, Orestes sent to Theodosius II an offensively impartial account of the incident. Some monks stoned the prefect. He had the leader of the mob arrested and tortured to death in 415. Cyril's supporters charged Hypatia with being the chief influence upon Orestes. She alone, they argued, prevented a reconciliation between the prefect and the patriarch. One day a band of fanatics, led by a reader, or minor clerk on Cyril's staff, pulled her from her carriage, dragged her into a church, stripped her of her garments, battered her to death with tiles, tore her corpse to pieces, and burned the remains in a savage orgy. This in 415. An act so inhuman, says Socrates, could not fail to bring the greatest opprobrium not only upon Cyril, but also upon the whole Alexandrian church. However, no personal punishment was exacted. The Emperor Theodosius II merely restricted the freedom of the monks to appear in public and excluded pagans from all public office. Cyril's victory was complete. Pagan professors of philosophy, after the death of Hypatia, sought security in Athens, where non-Christian teaching was still relatively and innocuously free. Student life was still lively there, and enjoyed most of the consolations of higher education: fraternities, distinctive garbs, hazing, and a general hilarity. The Stoic as well as the Epicurean school had now disappeared, but the Platonic Academy enjoyed a splendid decline under Themistius, Priscus, and Proclus. Themistius was destined to influence Averroes and other medieval thinkers by his commentaries on Aristotle. Priscus was for a time the friend and advisor of Julian. He was arrested by Valens and Valentinian I on a charge of using magic to give them a fever. He returned to Athens and taught there till his death at 90 in 395. Proclus, 410 to 485, like a true Platonist, approached philosophy through mathematics. A man of scholastic patience, he collated the ideas of Greek philosophy into one system and gave it a superficially scientific form. But he felt the mystic mood of Neoplatonism, too. By fasting and purification, he thought, one might enter into communion with supernatural beings. The schools of Athens had lost all vitality when Justinian closed them in 529. Their work lay in rehearsing again and again the theories of the ancient masters. They were oppressed and stifled by the magnitude of their heritage. Their only deviations were into a mysticism that borrowed from the less orthodox moods of Christianity. Justinian closed the schools of the rhetoricians as well as of the philosophers, confiscated their property, and forbade any pagan to teach. Greek philosophy, after 11 centuries of history, had come to an end. The passage from philosophy to religion, from Plato to Christ, stands out in certain strange Greek writings confidently ascribed by medieval thinkers to Dionysius the Areopagite, one of the Athenians who accepted the teaching of Paul. These works are chiefly four: on the celestial hierarchy, on the ecclesiastical hierarchy, on the divine names, and on mystical theology. We do not know by whom they were written, or when, or where. Their contents indicate an origin between the 4th and 6th centuries. We only know that few books have more deeply influenced Christian theology. John Scotus Erigena translated and built on one of them. Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas reverenced them. 100 mystics, Jewish and Moslem as well as Christian, fed on them, and medieval art and popular theology accepted them as an infallible guide to celestial beings and ranks. Their general purpose was to combine Neoplatonism with Christian cosmology. God, though incomprehensibly transcendent, is nevertheless immanent in all things as their source and life. Between God and man intervene three triads of supernatural beings: seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, dominations, virtues, and powers, principalities, archangels, and angels. The reader will recall how Dante ranged these 9 groups around the throne of God, and how Milton wove some of their names into a sonorous line. Creation in these works is by emanation. All things flow from God through these mediating angelic ranks, and then by a reverse process, these 9 orders of the celestial hierarchy lead men and all creation back to God. 3. Literature, 364 to 565. In 425, Theodosius II, or his regents, reorganized higher education in Constantinople and formally established a university of 31 teachers, 1 for philosophy, 2 for law, 28 for Latin and Greek grammar and rhetoric. These last included the study of the 2 literatures, and the large number of teachers assigned to them suggests a lively interest in letters. One such professor, Priscian, composed about 526 an immense grammar of Latin and Greek, which became one of the most famous textbooks of the Middle Ages. The Eastern Church seems to have raised no objections at this time to the copying of the pagan classics. Though a few saints protested, the school of Constantinople transmitted faithfully to the end of the Byzantine Empire the masterpieces of antiquity. And despite the rising cost of parchment, the flow of books was still abundant. About 450, Musaeus, of unknown provenance, composed his famous poem, Hero and Leander, how Leander anticipated Byron by swimming the Hellespont to reach his beloved Hero, how he died in the attempt, and how Hero, seeing him flung up dead at the foot of her tower, from the sheer crag plunged in hurtling headlong fall, to find with her dead love a death among the waves. It was the Christian gentlemen of the Byzantine court who composed, for the final installment of the Greek anthology, graceful love poems in the ancient moods and modes, and in terms of the pagan gods. Here, from Agathias, circa 550, is a song that may have helped Ben Jonson to a masterpiece. I love not wine, yet if thou'lt make a sad man merry, sip first sup, and when thou givest I'll take the cup. If thy lips touch it, for thy sake no more may I be stiff and stayed, and the luscious jug evade. The cup conveys thy kiss to me, and tells the joy it had of thee. The most important literary work of this age was done by the historians. Eunapius of Sardis composed a lost universal history of the period from 270 to 400, making Justinian his hero, and 23 gossipy biographies of the later sophists and Neoplatonists. Socrates, an Orthodox Christian of Constantinople, wrote a history of the Church from 309 to 439. It is fairly accurate and generally fair, as we have seen in the case of Hypatia. But this Socrates fills his narrative with superstitions, legends, and miracles, and talks so frequently of himself as if he found it hard to distinguish between himself and the cosmos. He ends with a novel plea for peace among the sects. If peace comes, he thinks, historians will have nothing to write about, and that miserable tribe of tragedy-mongers will cease. Mostly copied from Socrates is the ecclesiastical history of Sozomen, a convert from Palestine, and, like his model, a lawyer at the capital. Apparently a legal training was no handicap to superstition. Zosimus of Constantinople composed about 475 a history of the Roman Empire. He was a pagan, but did not yield to his Christian rivals in credulity and nonsense. Toward 525, Dionysius Exiguus, Denis the Short, suggested a new method of dating events from the supposed year of Christ's birth. The proposal was not accepted by the Latin Church till the 10th century, and the Byzantines continued to the end to number their years from the creation of the world. It is discouraging to note how many things were known to the youth of our civilization, which are unknown to us today. The one great historian of the period was Procopius. Born in Palestinian Caesarea in 490, he studied law, came to Constantinople, and was appointed secretary and legal advisor to Belisarius. He accompanied the general on the Syrian, African, and Italian campaigns and returned with him to the capital. In 550, he published his Books of the Wars. Knowing at first hand the merits of the general and the parsimony of the ruler, he made Belisarius a brilliant hero and left Justinian in the shade. The book was received with applause by the public, with silence by the emperor. Procopius now composed his Anecdota, or Secret History, but he kept it so successfully from publication or circulation that in 554 he was commissioned by Justinian to write an account of the buildings erected during the reign. Procopius issued De Edificiis in 560, and so loaded it with praise for the emperor that Justinian might well have suspected it of insincerity or irony. The Secret History was not given to the world until after Justinian, and perhaps Procopius, had died. It is a fascinating book, like any denunciation of our neighbors, but there is something unpleasant in literary attacks upon persons who can no longer speak in their own defense. An historian who strains his pen to prove a thesis may be trusted to distort the truth. Procopius was occasionally inaccurate in matters beyond his own experience. He copied, at times, the manner and philosophy of Herodotus, at times the speeches and sieges of Thucydides. He shared the superstitions of his age and darkened his pages with portents, oracles, miracles, and dreams. But where he wrote of what he had seen, his account has stood every test. His industry was courageous, his arrangement of materials is logical, his narrative is absorbing, his Greek is clear and direct and almost classically pure. Was he a Christian? Externally, yes, and yet at times he echoes the paganism of his models, the fatalism of the Stoa, the skepticism of the Academy. He speaks of fortune's perverse nature and unaccountable will. But these things, I believe, have never been comprehensible to man, nor will they ever be. Nevertheless, there is always much talk on these subjects, and opinions are always being bandied about, as each of us seeks comfort for his ignorance. I consider it insane folly to investigate the nature of God. I shall observe a discreet silence concerning these questions, with the sole subject that old and venerable beliefs may not be discredited. 4. Byzantine Art, 326 to 565. 1. The Passage from Paganism. The preeminent achievements of Byzantine civilization were governmental administration and decorative art, a state that survived 11 centuries, a St. Sophia that stands today. By Justinian's time, pagan art was finished, and half of its works had been mutilated or destroyed. Barbarian ravages, imperial robbery, and pious destruction had begun a process of ruination and neglect that continued till Petrarch in the 14th century pled, so to speak, for the lives of the survivors. A factor in the devastation was the popular belief that the pagan gods were demons, and that temples were their resorts. In any case, it was felt the material could be put to better use in Christian churches or domestic walls. Pagans themselves often joined in the spoliation. Several Christian emperors, notably Honorius and Theodosius II, did their best to protect the old structures, and enlightened clergymen preserved the Parthenon, the Temple of Theseus, the Pantheon, and other structures by rededicating them as Christian shrines. Christianity at first suspected art as a support of paganism, idolatry, and immorality. These nude statues hardly comported with esteem for virginity and celibacy. When the body seemed an instrument of Satan and the monk replaced the athlete as ideal, the study of anatomy disappeared from art, leaving a sculpture and painting of gloomy faces and shapeless drapery. But when Christianity had triumphed and great basilicas were needed to house its swelling congregations, the local and national traditions of art reasserted themselves, and architecture lifted itself out of the ruins. Moreover, these spacious edifices cried out for decoration. The worshippers needed statues of Christ and Mary to help the imagination, and pictures to tell the simple letterless the story of their crucified God. Sculpture, mosaic, and painting were reborn. In Rome, the new art differed little from the old. Strength of construction, simplicity of form, columnar basilican styles were carried down from paganism to Christianity. Near Nero's circus on the Vatican Hill, Constantine's architects had designed the first St. Peter's, with an awesome length of 380 feet and breadth of 212. For 12 centuries this remained the pontifical shrine of Latin Christendom, until Bramante tore it down to raise upon its site the still vaster St. Peter's of today. The church that Constantine built for St. Paul outside the walls, San Paolo fuori le mura, on the reputed site of the Apostles' martyrdom, was rebuilt by Valentinian II and Theodosius I on a scale quite as immense, 400 by 200 feet. Santa Constanza, raised by Constantine as a mausoleum for his sister Constantia, remains substantially as erected in 326 to 330. San Giovanni in Laterano, Santa Maria in Trastevere, San Lorenzo fuori le mura were rebuilt within a century after Constantine began them, and have since been many times repaired. Santa Maria Maggiore was adapted from a pagan temple in 432, and the nave remains essentially as then, save for Renaissance decorations. From that time to our own, the basilican plan has been a favorite design for Christian churches. Its modest cost, its majestic simplicity, its structural logic and sturdy strength have recommended it in every generation. But it did not lend itself readily to variation and development. European builders began to look about them for new ideas and found them in the East, even at Spalato, the Adriatic outpost of the Orient. There on the Dalmatian coast, Diocletian, at the opening of the 4th century, had given his artists free play to experiment in raising a palace for his retirement, and they accomplished a revolution in European architecture. Arches were there sprung directly from column capitals, with no intervening entablature. So at one stroke were prepared the Byzantine, Romanesque, and Gothic styles. And instead of figured friezes came in this palace a strange decoration of zigzag lines, offensive to the classic eye but long familiar to the Orient. Spalato was the first sign that Europe was to be conquered not only by an Oriental religion, but at least in the Byzantine world, by Oriental art. 2. The Byzantine artist. Whence came to Constantinople that uniquely colorful, somberly brilliant art known as Byzantine? It is a question over which archaeologists have fought with almost the ferocity of Christian soldiers, and by and large the victory has gone to the east. As Syria and Asia Minor grew stronger with industry, and Rome weaker with invasion, the Hellenistic tide that had rushed in with Alexander ebbed back from Asia to Europe. From Sasanian Persia, from Nestorian Syria, from Coptic Egypt, Eastern art influences poured into Byzantium and reached to Italy, even to Gaul. And the Greek art of naturalistic representation gave place to an Oriental art of symbolic decoration. The East preferred color to line, the vault and dome to the timbered roof, rich ornament to stern simplicity, gorgeous silks to shapeless togas. Just as Diocletian and Constantine had adopted the forms of Persian monarchy, so the art of Constantinople looked less and less to the now barbarized West, increasingly to Asia Minor, Armenia, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. Perhaps the victory of Persian arms under Shapur II and Khosru Anushirvan quickened the westward march of Eastern motives and forms. Edessa and Nisibis were in this period flourishing centers of a Mesopotamian culture that mingled Iranian, Armenian, Cappadocian, and Syrian elements, and transmitted them through merchants, monks, and artisans to Antioch, Alexandria, Ephesus, Constantinople, at last to Ravenna and Rome. The old classic orders, Doric, Ionian, Corinthian, became almost meaningless in an architectural world of arches, vaults, pendentives, and domes. Byzantine art, so generated, dedicated itself to expounding the doctrines of Christianity and displaying the glory of the state. It recounted on vestments and tapestries, in mosaics and murals, the life of Christ, the sorrows of Mary, the career of the apostle or martyr whose bones were enshrined in the church. Or it entered the court, decorated the palace of the sovereign, covered his official robes with symbolic emblems or historical designs, dazzled his subjects with flamboyant pageantry, and ended by representing Christ and Mary as an emperor and a queen. The Byzantine artist had small choice of patron, and therefore of subject or style. Monarch or patriarch told him what to do and how. He worked in a group, and seldom left an individual name to history. He achieved miracles of brilliance. He exalted and humbled the people with the splendor of his creations. But his art paid in formalism, narrowness, and stagnation for serving an absolute monarch and a changeless creed. He commanded abundant materials, marble quarries in the Proconnesus, Attica, Italy, spoliable columns and capitals wherever a pagan temple survived, and bricks almost growing in the sun-dried earth. Usually he worked with mortared brick. It lent itself well to the curved forms imposed upon him by Oriental styles. Often he contented himself with the cruciform plan, a basilica crossed with a transept and prolonged to an apse. Sometimes he broke the basilica into an octagon, as in Saints Sergius and Bacchus at Constantinople, or in San Vitale's at Ravenna. But his distinctive skill, in which he surpassed all artists before him or since, lay in raising a circular dome over a polygonal frame. His favorite means to this end was the pendentive. That is, he built an arch or semicircle of bricks over each side of the polygon, raised a spherical triangle of bricks upward and inward between each semicircle, and laid a dome upon the resultant circular ring. The spherical triangles were the pendentives, hanging from the ring of the dome to the top of the polygon. In architectural effect, the circle was squared. Thereafter, the basilican style almost disappeared from the East. Within the edifice, the Byzantine builder lavished all the skills of a dozen arts. He rarely used statuary. He sought not so much to represent figures of men and women as to create an abstract beauty of symbolic form. Even so, the Byzantine sculptors were artisans of ability, patience, and resource. They carved the Theodosian capital by combining the ears of the Ionic with the leaves of the Corinthian order. And to make profusion more confounded, they cut into this composite capital a very jungle of animals and plants. Since the result was not too well adapted to sustain a wall or an arch, they inserted between these and the capital an impost or pulvino, square and broad at the top, round and narrower at the base. And then in the course of time they carved this too with flowers. Here again, as in the domed square, Persia conquered Greece. But further, painters were assigned to adorn the walls with edifying or terrifying pictures. Mosaicists laid their cubes of brightly colored stone or glass in backgrounds of blue or gold upon the floors or walls or over the altar or in the spandrels of the arches or wherever an empty surface challenged the oriental eye. Jewelers set gems into vestments, altars, columns, walls. Metalworkers inserted gold or silver plates. Woodworkers carved the pulpit or chancel rails. Weavers hung tapestries, laid rugs, and covered altar and pulpit with embroidery and silk. Never before had an art been so rich in color, so subtle in symbolism, so exuberant in decoration, so well adapted to quiet the intellect and stir the soul. 3. St. Sophia. Not till Justinian did the Greek, Roman, Oriental, and Christian factors complete their fusion into Byzantine art. The Nika revolt gave him, like another Nero, an opportunity to rebuild his capital. In the ecstasy of a moment's freedom, the mob had burned down the Senate House, the baths of Zeuxippus, the porticos of the Augusteum, a wing of the imperial palace, and St. Sophia, cathedral of the Patriarch. Justinian might have rebuilt these on their old plans, and within a year or two. Instead, he resolved to spend more time, money, and men, make his capital more beautiful than Rome, and raise a church that would outshine all other edifices on the earth. He began now one of the most ambitious building programs in history. Fortresses, palaces, monasteries, churches, porticos, and gates rose throughout the empire. In Constantinople, he rebuilt the Senate House in white marble and the baths of Zeuxippus in polychrome marble, raised a marble portico and promenade in the Augusteum, and brought fresh water to the city in a new aqueduct that rivaled Italy's best. He made his own palace the acme of splendor and luxury. Its floors and walls were of marble, its ceilings recounted in mosaic brilliance the triumphs of his reign, and showed the senators in festal mood, bestowing upon the emperor honors almost divine. And across the Bosporus, near Chalcedon, he built, as a summer residence for Theodora and her court, the palatial villa of Hieron, equipped with its own harbor, forum, church, and baths. 40 days after the Nika revolt had subsided, he began a new St. Sophia, dedicated not to any saint of that name, but to the Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom or creative logos of God himself. From Tralles in Asia Minor, from Ionian Miletus, he summoned Anthemius and Isidore, the most famous of living architects, to plan and superintend the work. Abandoning the traditional basilican form, they conceived a design whose center would be a spacious dome resting not on walls, but on massive piers, and buttressed by a half-dome at either end. 10,000 workmen were engaged, 320,000 pounds of gold, or $134 million were spent on the enterprise, quite emptying the treasury. Provincial governors were directed to send to the new shrine the finest relics of ancient monuments. Marbles of a dozen kinds and tints were imported from a dozen areas. Gold, silver, ivory, and precious stones were poured into the decoration. Justinian himself shared busily in the design and the construction, took no small part, his scornful adulator tells us, in solving technical problems. Dressed in white linen, with a staff in his hand and a kerchief on his head, he haunted the operation day after day, encouraging the workers to complete their tasks competently and on time. In 5 years and 10 months the edifice was complete, and on December 26, 537, the emperor and the patriarch Minas led a solemn inaugural procession to the resplendent cathedral. Justinian walked alone to the pulpit, and lifting up his hands cried out, "Glory be to God, who has thought me worthy to accomplish so great a work. O Solomon, I have vanquished you." The ground plan was a Greek cross, 250 by 225 feet. Each end of the cross was covered by a minor dome. The central dome rose over the square, 100 by 100 feet, formed by the intersecting arms. The apex of the dome was 180 feet above the ground. Its diameter was 100 feet, 32 less than the dome of the Pantheon in Rome. The latter had been poured in concrete in one solid piece. St. Sophia's dome was made of brick in 30 converging panels, a much weaker construction. In fact, in 558, an earthquake caused half the central dome to crash into the church. The dead Isidore's son, Isidore, rebuilt the dome, strengthening its supports and raising it 25 feet higher than before. Cracks in these supports suggest that the dome now lives a precarious life. The distinction of this dome was not in size, but in support. It rested not on a circular structure, as in the Pantheon, but on pendentives and arches that mediated between the circular rim and the square base. Never has this architectural problem been more satisfactorily solved. Procopius described the dome as a work admirable and terrifying, seeming not to rest on the masonry below it, but to be suspended by a chain of gold from the height of the sky. The interior was a panorama of luminous decoration. Marble of many colors, white, green, red, yellow, purple, gold, made the pavement, walls, and two-storied colonnades look like a field of flowers. Delicate stone carvings covered capitals, arches, spandrels, moldings, and cornices with classic leaves of acanthus and vine. Mosaics of unprecedented scope and splendor looked down from walls and vaults. 40 silver chandeliers hanging from the rim of the dome helped as many windows to illuminate the church. The sense of spaciousness left by the long nave and aisles, and by the pillarless space under the central dome, the metal lacework of the silver railing before the apse and of the iron railing in the upper gallery, the pulpit inset with ivory, silver, and precious stones, the solid silver throne of the patriarch, the silk and gold curtain that rose over the altar with figures of the emperor and the empress receiving the benedictions of Christ and Mary, the golden altar itself of rare marbles and bearing sacred vessels of silver and gold. This lavish ornamentation might have warranted Justinian in anticipating the boast of the Mogul Shahs, that they built like giants and finished like jewelers. St. Sophia was at once the inauguration and the culmination of the Byzantine style. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.